June 19, 1944. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath the morning sun, a polished mirror of blue that concealed the most lethal game of the war. Deep below the surface, steel and men moved as one, a single machine of silence and tension. The USS Albacore, a Gato-class submarine, prowled beneath the rolling waves, running quiet on electric motors. Inside, the crew felt the claustrophobic pressure of the sea pressing against their hull, every sound magnified, every heartbeat louder than it should have been. The air was stale with diesel fumes and human breath, the temperature near unbearable. Yet no one complained. They had been trained to live and fight in the deep, where the boundary between life and death was a single turn of a valve, a single bearing off course. For days, they had been tracking a Japanese fleet. Rumors had spread through the silent corridors that this was no ordinary task force. The men whispered in the dark about the enemy's new supercarrier, a ship so vast and armored that the Japanese themselves believed her unsinkable. Her name was Taihō. The Taihō represented the last breath of Japan's naval supremacy. Launched in 1943, she was the pride of the empire, the first Japanese carrier built with an armored flight deck. Her designers claimed she could withstand bomb hits that would cripple any other carrier. She carried over 70 aircraft, her hull shielded by steel plates instead of wooden planking. Her engines could drive her through the water at over 30 knots, a leviathan of fire and power. To the Japanese fleet, she was a symbol of resurgence, a fortress that would restore the balance in the Pacific after Midway's humiliation. To the Americans, she was a challenge that had to be met with precision and nerve. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was already raging above the horizon. Thousands of miles from home, fleets of carriers and battleships clashed across the vast expanse of the ocean. The sky was filled with contrails, the screams of engines, and the shattering bursts of anti-aircraft fire. American carrier pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a slaughter of Japanese aircraft that would end the offensive capacity of the Imperial Navy for good. But beneath those skies, in the unseen depths, another drama was unfolding, one that would change the course of naval warfare with a single torpedo. Commander James W. Blanchard, captain of the USS Albacore, was not a man given to nerves. He had hunted Japanese shipping across the Pacific since 1942. His boat had already sunk tankers, destroyers, and transports. But this mission was different. Intelligence had reported that a major Japanese fleet was steaming north to intercept American forces near Saipan. Within that fleet was their largest carrier, their pride, and Blanchard's orders were simple. If he saw her, he was to attack at any cost. For 48 hours, Albacore tracked the enemy formation. The sonar men could hear the faint heartbeat of distant propellers, rhythmic and steady, the sound of a fleet on the move. Above them, the Japanese formation stretched across dozens of miles, battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, and carriers, moving with machine-like precision. Albacore was a lone hunter beneath a city of warships. One misstep, one echo too loud, and she would be crushed by depth charges before she could even fire. Yet the crew worked methodically, calculating the intercept. The sea around them was dark and infinite, filled with the ghosts of ships already sunk in the endless Pacific. By morning, the sound of propellers grew louder. The enemy was near. The submarine's hydrophones caught the heavy rhythmic pulse of large screws, the kind that only a capital ship produced. Every man in the control room held his breath. Bearings were called in hushed tones. Depth adjusted, speed reduced to a crawl. Somewhere above them, the world's largest aircraft carrier was passing through the narrow band of their firing range. The opportunity would last less than a minute. Albacore's torpedo crew readied 6 Mark 14 torpedoes. Each was over 20 feet long, weighing nearly 2 tons, fitted with a 643-pound warhead of high explosive. The weapon had been plagued by malfunctions throughout the war, depth-keeping errors, faulty detonators, magnetic triggers that failed to fire. Submarine crews cursed them, sometimes watching helplessly as perfect shots passed beneath enemy ships or struck without exploding. But there was no other choice. Blanchard and his men would trust their lives once again to a weapon known for betrayal. Above, the Japanese formation sailed unaware. The Taihō's decks were alive with motion. Mechanics fueled aircraft, pilots prepared for launch, officers shouted orders over the roar of engines. She was leading Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet, the core of Japan's naval air power. Her task was to strike the American invasion force around Saipan and Guam, to deliver a blow that would halt the United States' relentless advance toward the home islands. But below her, unseen in the green depths, an American submarine waited for the moment to end her voyage forever. The shot was taken at 0859 hours. A single torpedo left Albacore's forward tube, streaking upward through the layers of salt water, toward destiny. For 30 seconds, there was only silence. Then a faint tremor ran through the hull, followed by a distant thud that rolled across the sea like a heartbeat. The men waited, listening. They did not know it then, but the torpedo had found its mark. It struck the Taihō on her starboard side, beneath the armored deck, puncturing her aviation fuel tanks. The explosion itself was minor, barely noticeable compared to the thunder of her engines, but the damage it unleashed would prove catastrophic. Inside Taihō, damage control teams reported flooding and the smell of gasoline. The armored deck had contained the blast, but it also trapped the volatile fumes. Pumps were started, vents opened, but in the confusion of war, the stakes multiplied. Ventilation fans fed the gasoline vapor through the ship's lower compartments, turning the entire carrier into a floating bomb. The crew worked feverishly, unaware that every moment brought them closer to annihilation. Far below, the men of Albacore remained silent. Blanchard had no time to confirm the kill. The moment the torpedo hit, Japanese destroyers began sweeping the area. Depth charges fell in violent patterns, their concussions hammering against the submarine's hull. Instruments rattled, gauges flickered, lights dimmed. The men lay flat on the deck, hands over their ears, as shockwaves rolled through the steel. Each explosion drew the oxygen from their lungs. Each pause between them felt like an eternity. The submarine shuddered, but held. Slowly, hour by hour, she slipped away, evading the destroyers that hunted her. Above, the Taihō continued to sail, wounded but proud. Her flight deck still launched aircraft, her engines still roared. Admiral Ozawa believed the situation was under control. Reports from below were confused, but the carrier appeared stable. He ordered operations to continue, yet the invisible poison of gasoline vapor thickened in the hangars, seeping into every corridor. Crewmen began to cough and choke, their eyes burning. Some lit cigarettes without understanding the danger. Damage control teams sprayed foam and seawater, unaware that the ship's own ventilation system was feeding the flames that had not yet begun. By midday, the heat inside the carrier had become unbearable. The Taihō's commander, Captain Kaku, ordered the ship ventilated to clear the fumes. Massive blowers were activated, forcing fresh air through the hangar decks. It was a fatal mistake. The gasoline vapor mixed with oxygen, and deep within the ship, a spark ignited. At 1400 hours, a thunderous explosion tore through the carrier's heart. Flames erupted through the flight deck, lifting aircraft and men into the sky. The armored deck that had once been her strength now became a tomb, sealing the fire inside. Witnesses from nearby ships saw a column of black smoke rise thousands of feet into the air. The Taihō shuddered, listing to starboard, her hull split open by the pressure of trapped explosions. For hours she burned until finally, as the sun began to set over the Philippine Sea, the pride of Japan's navy sank beneath the waves. Over 1,600 officers and men were lost. When news of her sinking reached Admiral Ozawa, disbelief turned to silence. The Japanese command could not accept that a single American submarine, a lone hunter lost in the expanse of the Pacific, had destroyed their most advanced carrier. But the evidence was undeniable. One torpedo, one moment, had erased years of engineering, millions of tons of steel, and the illusion of invincibility. In the control room of the Albacore, there was no celebration. The crew did not yet know what they had done. Their instruments recorded no explosion large enough to confirm a sinking. Blanchard assumed he had damaged the carrier, perhaps crippled her. They returned to patrol depth, conserving batteries, navigating through the deep like ghosts. The men were exhausted, their clothes soaked with sweat, their nerves frayed by the endless pounding of depth charges. When they surfaced at night, the Pacific stretched calm and empty, the stars reflected in the dark water. None of them could see the distant glow where the Taihō still burned, her wreckage scattered across the surface of the sea. The ocean was vast enough to swallow every secret. To the men of the Albacore, the mission was another day in a war that had no end in sight. To history, it would become one of the great ironies of the Pacific War. that the most advanced carrier ever built by Japan was destroyed not by a fleet or a bombardment, but by a single submarine firing one imperfect torpedo. For the Imperial Navy, the loss of Taihō was more than a tactical defeat, it was a symbol of decline. It shattered the illusion that Japan could match America's industrial and technological power. Within months, the empire's once mighty fleets would be reduced to scattered remnants, hunted across the seas. The Pacific, once a Japanese domain, had become an American ocean, and it had begun, quietly, beneath the surface. In the stillness where one submarine waited in silence for the perfect shot, the USS Albacore continued her patrols until the end of 1944. In November, she vanished off Hokkaido, likely destroyed by mines. No trace of her crew was ever found. The men who had sunk the Taihō disappeared into the same sea that had carried their triumph. The story of that morning in June lived on through naval records and survivor accounts. It became a testament to the strange balance of war, the irony that human genius could build a fortress, and human error could destroy it in an instant. The Taihō's loss marked the end of an era for Japan, and the dawn of a new kind of warfare, where technology, endurance, and luck decided the fate of empires. Beneath the calm surface of the Philippine Sea, silence returned. The currents drifted through the wreckage, carrying fragments of steel and memories into the deep. The ocean forgot, but history remembered, and in that memory, one submarine's single torpedo became a symbol of inevitability, the moment when the tide of the Pacific War turned forever. In 1944, the Pacific War had reached its decisive phase. The Empire of Japan, once master of the seas, was being driven back on every front. The vast territory conquered in the early years of the war had become a burden too great to defend. American bombers struck deeper each month, island by island, mile by mile, tightening the noose around the imperial perimeter. The once proud Japanese fleet had been reduced to fragments of its former power. Its carriers scattered, its pilots inexperienced, its supply lines shattered by the relentless pressure of the United States Navy. Yet even as defeat loomed, the Imperial Navy clung to the belief that a single decisive battle could still change everything. This belief had its roots deep in Japan's military culture. Since the victory over Russia in 1905, the Japanese Navy had built its doctrine around the idea of one grand confrontation, a modern reincarnation of Tsushima. They envisioned a climactic clash where the enemy's main fleet would be destroyed in a single stroke, restoring Japan's mastery of the seas. That doctrine had guided every strategy, every ship, every life spent in the Pacific. Even after Midway, when 4 of Japan's front-lying carriers were destroyed, the spirit of Tsushima haunted their planning rooms. They told themselves the loss had been temporary, that with new ships and new pilots, they could strike again. By mid-1944, that illusion had become the last refuge of a dying empire. American forces had landed on Saipan in the Marianas, within striking distance of the Japanese homeland. The island, ringed by coral and volcanic ridges, was the key to everything. From Saipan, the United States could launch B-29 superfortresses against Tokyo itself. To the Japanese high command, the prospect was unthinkable. The Marianas had to be held at all costs. The combined fleet was ordered to mobilize every available carrier, battleship, and cruiser to repel the invasion. The operation was named Go, and it would be Japan's final attempt to reverse the tide of the Pacific War. At the heart of that operation stood the new flagship of the fleet, the carrier Taihō. She had been designed as a masterpiece of naval engineering, the culmination of every lesson Japan had learned from 2 decades of carrier warfare. Her armored flight deck, her massive fuel reserves, and her advanced radar and communication systems made her the most powerful ship ever built by the Japanese Navy. To Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, she was more than a ship. She was a promise of renewal, a steel embodiment of hope. When Taihō left the dockyards at Yokosuka in early 1944, even the emperor took notice. Crowds gathered to see her glide into the bay, her hull gleaming under the morning light, banners fluttering above her conning tower. Newspapers hailed her as the invincible guardian of the Pacific, the fortress that would turn the tide. But beneath the propaganda lay the harsh reality. Japan's shipyards had produced a marvel of steel, but they could not produce time. The experienced carrier crews of 1941 were gone, lost over Midway, Coral Sea, and Santa Cruz. The new air groups aboard Taihō were filled with barely trained pilots, many with fewer than 100 flight hours. Their aircraft, though formidable on paper, were plagued by shortages of fuel, spare parts, and maintenance crews. Even before the battle began, the Japanese Navy was stretched beyond its limits. Fuel convoys had to sneak through American submarines that hunted across every route between the home islands and the southern territories. Every gallon of aviation fuel, every spare piston, every aircraft carrier that reached the Marianas was already a victory of desperation. The Americans, in contrast, had learned and adapted. By the summer of 1944, the United States had launched an industrial surge unparalleled in history. In the time it had taken Japan to build a single carrier, the Americans had built 10. Their pilots rotated through constant combat and rigorous training. Their logistics chains spanned the entire ocean. When Admiral Raymond Struense's Fifth Fleet sailed toward the Marianas, it brought with it 15 carriers, hundreds of escort ships, and over 900 aircraft. Against this tidal wave, Japan's ago operation was doomed from the moment it began. Yet the Japanese Navy still believed in fate. They planned to strike from the shadows, using their remaining carriers to lure the American fleet into a trap. Their carriers would launch a massive wave of aircraft from a distance, while land-based bombers from Guam and the Philippines would attack from another direction. It was a strategy of coordination and precision, but one that depended on perfect timing and flawless communication to luxuries the Japanese no longer possessed. The Taihō was at the center of this grand design. As flagship, she carried Admiral Ozawa and his entire command staff. Her decks were crowded with Zero fighters, Judy dive bombers, and Jill torpedo planes. Mechanics worked through the night preparing them for the first wave. Her engines, powerful and untested in battle, rumbled beneath her armored hull. Officers walked the corridors with an air of grim pride. The ship's captain, Takatsubu Kaku, had served aboard carriers since the beginning of the war. He knew that morale was as fragile as steel, that a ship was only as strong as the belief of the men who sailed her. He told his officers that Taihō was invulnerable, that no enemy bomb or torpedo could breach her deck. It was a lie, but a necessary one. As the fleet assembled near the Philippine Sea, the Americans were already watching. Their submarines had been tracking the Japanese buildup for weeks. Codebreakers at Pearl Harbor had deciphered much of the Japanese communications, revealing the timing and direction of their movements. The ocean that Japan believed to be its shield had become a net of American steel and intelligence. Every convoy, every movement of the fleet risked exposure. Yet even knowing this, the Japanese pressed on, driven by pride, duty, and the fatalism that marked the end of every empire. For the men of the USS Albacore, these grand strategies were distant abstractions. They did not see the maps or the plans, only the gray patterns of sound through their sonar and the faint vibrations that traveled through the sea. They lived in the void between silence and death, guided by instinct and mathematics. Submarine warfare was the most intimate kind of battle. There was no room for error, no distance between hunter and hunted. Every command, every calculation, every movement of the rudder was measured against the invisible weight of the ocean pressing down from above. They had no way of knowing that the fleet they were tracking carried the fate of the Pacific in its wake. To them, it was just another target, another convoy, another series of propeller beats that echoed through the hydrophones. The United States Navy's submarine force had become the unseen blade of the Pacific War. At the start of the conflict, submarines have been an auxiliary arm used for reconnaissance and harassment, but as the war progressed, they had grown into a strategic weapon. By 1944, American submarines had cut Japan's lifelines, sinking tankers, troop transports, and cargo ships faster than the empire could replace them. More than 60% of Japan's merchant fleet lay on the ocean floor. Submarines had turned the Pacific into a killing ground. They hunted not only for ships, but for survival, enduring the suffocating terror of depth charges and the loneliness of endless patrols. The Albacore was one of those hunters. Commissioned in 1942, she had already completed 8 patrols. Her crew was seasoned, hardened by months of combat beneath the waves. They had faced the same fears as every submarine crew: torpedo failures, battery leaks, sonar pings that echoed like the heartbeat of death. Yet they had also learned patience, the patience of predators, who knew that the sea rewarded silence. Each man aboard had his own reasons for fighting. Some were driven by vengeance for Pearl Harbor, others by duty, others by the grim rhythm of war that had consumed their youth. Together, they formed a single mind, a machine built for one purpose: to find the enemy and destroy him. In the spring of 1944, Albacore departed Pearl Harbor for her 9th war patrol. Her orders were to patrol the approaches to the Philippine Sea, to intercept enemy convoys moving toward the Marianas. As she left the harbor, her hull gleamed in the early light, streaked with salt from previous missions. The crew watched the coastline recede, knowing that some of them would never see it again. They had no illusions about glory. Submarine warfare offered little of it. Victories were unseen, recorded in numbers and tonnage. There were no parades, no photographs, no medals pinned in daylight. Only the quiet acknowledgement of another enemy ship gone, another mission complete. The days that followed were monotonous and tense. Life aboard a submarine was a cycle of waiting, sweating, and listening. The smell of oil and metal clung to the air. Men slept beside torpedoes, ate beside engines, and dreamed beneath the hum of machinery. Every sound in the ocean could be a signal of life or death: the distant thrum of propellers, the faint rumble of depth charges exploding miles away, the eerie groan of shifting water pressure. They had learned to tell by ear the difference between a merchant ship and a destroyer, between a fleet moving at speed and a single vessel drifting on the current. Then, one morning in June, their instruments caught the sound of something vast. The sonar pulses returned a pattern unlike anything they had heard before. It was not a convoy, it was an armada. The sound was thick, layered, the overlapping rhythm of hundreds of engines. They knew instantly that this was the Japanese fleet. What they could not know was that among those signals was the heartbeat of the Taihō, the pride of Japan's navy, leading her final voyage. Above them, in the sunlight, the Japanese formation advanced with calculated grandeur. Battleships like Musashi and Yamato had once symbolized the empire's might, but now carriers were the true queens of the sea. Taihō steamed at the center of the formation. Her escorting destroyers fanned out like guardians of a monarch. Her deck crews worked in heat and humidity, preparing aircraft for the coming strike. The smell of aviation fuel filled the air, and mechanics cursed the shortage of equipment. Many of the younger sailors had never been at sea during a major battle. They looked out over the endless water, imagining the enemy beyond the horizon, unaware that he was already beneath their feet. The Japanese officers who stood on her bridge that morning believed they were sailing to glory. Admiral Ozawa had convinced himself that the gods of war still favored Japan. He looked to the horizon and saw not doom, but destiny. He had served the empire since its rise to modern power. He had seen the victories at Malaya, Java, and the Philippines. When Japanese forces seemed unstoppable, he could not accept that those days were gone. To him, Taihō was proof that Japan could still command the seas. He could not know that in a few hours, his flagship would become a furnace, and his fleet would lose its last hope of victory. As the fleet pushed westward, the American submarines shadowed from the deep. Albacore was one of 2 boats positioned in the path of the Japanese advance. The other, USS Cavallo, would soon make her own attack against another carrier. The ocean between them and the enemy was vast, but every mile closed brought them closer to the chance they had waited for. The stakes could not have been higher. If they could strike the heart of the Japanese fleet, they would cripple the enemy's last offensive. If they failed, the price would be their lives. Beneath the calm blue surface of the Philippine Sea, history moved unseen. The submarine's crew worked in silence, adjusting bearings, refining calculations. The captain's orders were few, his voice calm, his movements deliberate. Each man understood his role. The weight of the war, the hopes of unseen fleets above them, rested on their shoulders. The ocean pressed down in a heavy, endless stillness. In that pressure, courage became something quiet, measured not in shots or heroics, but in endurance, the ability to act with precision while the world above moved toward chaos. The stage was set. The largest carrier Japan had ever built steamed into battle, confident in her armor and speed. Below, a single submarine waited in the darkness, armed with 6 imperfect torpedoes. 2 empires, 2 visions of the sea, were about to collide in a single act that would echo through history. The men aboard both ships did not yet know that within hours, one of them would vanish from the surface of the world forever, leaving only oil, wreckage, and silence in her place. The dawn that broke over the Philippine Sea on June 19th was clear and deceptively peaceful. The horizon was a pale blue line, the sky unbroken by clouds, the sea calm as glass. For the men aboard the Japanese fleet, it seemed an omen of favor. But beneath that still surface, the ocean concealed an unseen predator waiting for the moment when the calm would shatter. The USS Albacore, lying at periscope depth, was already locked onto the approaching fleet. Through the narrow lens of the periscope, indistinct silhouettes began to rise from the haze, first the sharp bow waves of destroyers, then the flat silhouettes of carriers, and finally the immense shape of the Taihō herself, cutting through the sea like a fortress in motion. The tension within the submarine was suffocating. The crew had been at battle stations since dawn, the air thick with oil and sweat. Every sound in the hull was amplified: the whisper of bearings, the faint metallic creak of pressure, the distant heartbeat of the engines. Men spoke in whispers, though speech was almost unnecessary. They had done this before. Every man knew his part in the ritual of the hunt. The torpedo data computer ticked softly as angles and ranges were entered, numbers turning into destiny. The target was immense, fast, and well guarded. Around her, destroyers weaved like wolves, their sonar pings slicing through the water. The submarine was invisible, but not invulnerable. One mistake, one cavitation bubble, and those pings would turn into explosions. Above them, the Taihō advanced in perfect confidence. Her lookouts scanned the horizon, but the sea appeared empty. There was no sign of the enemy. Her planes, fueled and armed, were being brought to the deck. The first strikes were already forming on the horizon. Columns of Japanese aircraft climbing into the blue, heading toward the distant American carriers. The atmosphere aboard was tense, but disciplined. Officers moved briskly along the catwalks, shouting orders above the roar of engines. Mechanics tightened bolts, wiped oil from their hands, and prayed under their breath. They did not know that below their hull, within range of their own destroyers, an American submarine was aligning for a single perfect shot. Commander Blanchard stood over the plotting table, his eyes fixed on the dials. The target was immense, the opportunity fleeting. The Taihō was moving fast to fast for a standard 6-torpedo spread. To attempt a broadside against her escort screen would be suicide. The decision had to be instantaneous. He calculated her course, her speed, her angle across the bow. The data pointed to a narrow firing window, a single chance where mathematics met instinct. The range closed, the crosshairs steadied, the silence deepened into something alive. Then, in one unbroken command, the torpedo room released the weapon. The Mark 14 torpedo left its tube with a dull mechanical shudder. It sliced through the water, its compressed air engine churning a faint trail of bubbles. The men inside the submarine could not see it, but they could feel it, a vibration that faded into the depths as the torpedo raced upward. The seconds that followed stretched into eternity. 30 seconds that could mean either triumph or death. They waited, counting the beats of the clock, listening for the sound that would decide everything. Then, faint and distant, came the low, muffled thud of an explosion. The submarine vibrated, the instruments rattled. The men exchanged glances, but said nothing. There was no time to confirm the hit. The sonar operator's headphones were already alive with sound. Destroyers were turning. Their propeller beats accelerated. The hunter had become the hunted. Commander Blanchard ordered the boat to dive. The Albacore slid downward into the dark, leaving the scene of the strike behind as depth charges began to fall. The explosions came in waves. Each one detonated with a heavy, rolling concussion that shook the submarine like a living thing. The lights flickered. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Men braced themselves against bulkheads, covering their ears as the sound rolled through the hull. There was no rhythm to it, sometimes three in quick succession, sometimes long, dreadful pauses, filled only by the groan of stressed metal. The destroyers above had found their target zone and were determined to kill whatever lurked beneath it. But the sea was vast, and sound deceptive. The Albacore changed depth, altered course, and played dead. The ocean silence closed around her once more, absorbing the violence into its eternal calm. Above, the Taihō's damage control teams moved quickly to assess the impact. The explosion had been minor, barely felt on the bridge. The carrier's armored hull had absorbed most of the force. But the torpedo had struck a critical point beneath her aviation fuel tanks, near the starboard side. A thin seam of steel had ruptured, allowing fuel to leak into lower compartments. The immediate damage seemed controllable. Pumps were started, hatches sealed. To Admiral Ozawa, the report sounded reassuring. The ship could continue operations. Planes were still being launched. Her engines still thundered. The idea that the greatest carrier Japan had ever built could be crippled by one submarine torpedo seemed absurd. But the true danger lay invisible, spreading through the ship like a ghost. The aviation fuel that leaked from the ruptured tanks began to evaporate into the lower decks, forming a mist of gasoline vapor. The tie seal design, once a symbol of her strength, now trapped the fumes inside. In the heat of the machinery spaces, the air grew thick and toxic. Men began to cough, their eyes burning. Ventilation crews tried to clear the compartments, but the system itself carried the fumes farther, pumping them through the ship's passageways. The carrier had become a bomb waiting for a spark. The hours that followed were a slow descent into chaos. Reports of fuel leaks multiplied. The engineers fought to contain the flooding while pilots continued to launch sorties from the deck above. Communication between compartments broke down. Orders were misunderstood or ignored. The ship's crew numbered nearly 2,000 men, and coordination across its vast steel labyrinth depended on clear lines of command. As smoke and vapor filled the lower decks, visibility dropped, and panic began to spread. Captain Kaku ordered additional ventilation, believing that fresh air would dissipate the fumes. He could not have known that it would do the opposite. By noon, the ship's interior had become a death trap. The temperature in some compartments reached unbearable levels. Crewmen stumbled through smoke-filled corridors, opening hatches in search of breathable air. The vapor thickened, gathering near the machinery spaces where the torpedo had struck. A single spark, a static discharge, a careless tool strike. The heat of a motor was all it would take. The inevitable moment came without warning. Deep in the carrier's lower decks, a violent blast tore through the ship, ripping bulkheads apart. The explosion lifted sections of the armored deck, throwing men into the air like leaves in a storm. Flames erupted, racing along the hangar bays where fuel lines and bombs lay exposed. From nearby ships, witnesses saw the explosion plume like a flower of fire. Smoke rose thousands of feet into the sky, black and oily, marking the death of a giant. On the Taihō's bridge, Admiral Ozawa stood in stunned silence. The pride of his fleet was engulfed in flame. Communication was lost with the hangar decks. Firefighting teams were overwhelmed. The heat melted steel, shattered glass, and consumed oxygen faster than pumps could replace it. The crew fought desperately, sealing compartments, flooding sections to contain the blaze. Some continued to believe the ship could be saved, that her armor would hold. For hours, they fought a losing battle against the elements, the fire, the heat, the air itself turning poisonous. In the chaos, the realization dawned too late. The ventilation system, the very mechanism meant to preserve life, had become the carrier's doom. It fed the fire with oxygen, spreading flames through every corridor. The armored flight deck trapped the pressure until, at 1400 hours, a second explosion tore through the ship. It was larger than the first, erupting from within like the heart of a volcano. Aircraft on the deck were hurled into the sky, engines and wings disintegrating in the blast. Men were flung into the sea. The Taihō listed sharply to starboard, her hull cracked, her engines failing. Within minutes, her forward compartments were underwater. By late afternoon, the once proud flagship was a blackened ruin. Her escorting destroyers drew near, their decks lined with sailors watching in horror as the carrier burned. They could hear the faint cries of survivors through the smoke. Rescue efforts began, but the sea was covered in oil and debris, the heat unbearable. Explosions still rippled through the ship as ammunition and fuel ignited. By 1600 hours, the order was given to abandon ship. Captain Kaku remained on the bridge, refusing to leave his post. The sea boiled around the sinking hulk as men leapt into the water, their uniforms aflame. When the Taihō finally went down, it was almost gentle. The stern rose, the boat dipped, and then she was gone, swallowed by the Pacific in a rolling hiss of steam and fire. Over 1,600 men perished. The survivors floated amid wreckage, watching the last bubbles rise from the depths where their ship had disappeared. The smoke drifted away with the wind, leaving only silence, Far below, the Albacore continued its escape, unaware of the destruction it had caused. The submarine's crew could not see the columns of smoke or hear the explosions. They remained submerged, running silent, every sense focused on survival. The destroyers above had not given up the hunt. Depth charges continued to fall for hours, their echoes rolling through the water. Each explosion was a reminder that in the deep, triumph and death were indistinguishable, until long after the fact. It was only days later, through intercepted Japanese communications, that American intelligence confirmed the sinking. The Taihō was gone, the newest, most advanced carrier of the Imperial Navy, destroyed by a single torpedo. For the United States, it was a victory that symbolized the precision and endurance of their undersea war. For Japan, it was a tragedy too great to accept. The loss was concealed from the public, buried beneath official reports of heroism and sacrifice. But among the officers of the fleet, the truth was clear. The last illusion of Japanese naval invincibility had been erased. The irony was brutal. The ship designed to survive the heaviest bomb strikes, the culmination of Japan's engineering pride, had been undone by her own strength. Her armor had trapped the very forces meant to be resisted. Her advanced systems had turned against her. Her design, conceived in triumph, had become her curse. The lesson would not be lost on naval architects, but for the men who had perished. It came too late. The Battle of the Philippine Sea raged on her grave. American pilots shot down hundreds of Japanese aircraft, their enemies' inexperience evident in every encounter. The sky became a graveyard of burning planes, the sea littered with oil and debris. The Japanese fleet retreated in disorder, its air arms shattered, its flagship lost. The victory was total. Yet beneath the celebration, the war continued its merciless pace. The Albacore would go on to fight again, unaware that her greatest kill had already changed the course of history. In that collision of fate and metal, the essence of the Pacific War was captured. One nation's faith in steel and spirit met another's mastery of industry and persistence. Beneath the waves, where no one could see the faces of the men who made history, courage was silent, mechanical, and precise. The torpedo that left Albacore's tube was not just a weapon. It was the embodiment of a new kind of warfare, one fought in darkness, guided by mathematics and patience rather than glory. As night fell over the Philippine Sea, the wreck of the Taihō rested on the seabed, her twisted hull still warm, her flag torn but unburned. The ocean closed over her as if nothing had happened. Above, the stars reappeared, indifferent and eternal. The men who had survived drifted in lifeboats, listening to the gentle slap of waves against debris, the distant rumble of battle fading into the horizon. For them, the war would go on. For the Taihō, it was over. The ocean remembers nothing. It moves, erases, and conceals. The great ships that once dominated its surface vanish beneath it, leaving only a shimmer of oil and the faint echo of their passing. On that June afternoon in 1944, the Philippine Sea became a graveyard. The destruction of the Taihō was only one note in a vast symphony of violence. Above her sinking hull, the largest carrier battle in history was reaching its crescendo. The air itself trembled with engines and explosions. Waves of Japanese aircraft, hundreds strong, were torn apart in the sky long before they could reach their targets. Below, the submarine that had begun it all drifted deeper into the darkness, battered but unbroken. The USS Albacore was blind in that darkness. Every explosion, every shockwave, came to them only as vibration, as pressure transmitted through the skin of the hull. Men held their breath as the destroyers searched overhead. The sound of sonar pings pierced the silence, slow and regular, like the beat of a distant heart. When one passed close, it sent a shiver through the entire crew. The next sound might be the rumble of another depth charge. The captain ordered the boat deeper. Metal groaned under the weight of the sea. Every rivet in the hull seemed to whisper the same thing: too deep, too far, too long. But there was no other way. Survival meant descent. Survival meant patience. The Albacore had no idea that the fleet above was disintegrating, that its single torpedo had already accomplished more than any bomber squadron that day. Yet in the logic of submarine warfare, ignorance was safety. The less they knew, the less they hesitated. For hours they remained at depth, riding out the concussions. When finally they surfaced, it was under a sky darkened by smoke and scattered wreckage. The horizon was empty except for drifting fuel slicks and the distant glow of burning ships. The war had moved on without them, as it always did. On the surface, the Japanese fleet was a ghost of its former order. Destroyers darted through curtains of smoke, pulling men from the sea. Aircraft circled aimlessly, searching for ships that were no longer there. Communication had broken down. Messages were confused, coordinates lost. The air was filled with static and the occasional desperate call for assistance. Among the survivors pulled from the water were men from the Taihō, their faces blackened with oil, their eyes hollow with disbelief. To them, the loss was unthinkable. The flagship, the pride of the empire, had been destroyed not by an enemy fleet, not by an air raid, but by a single submarine that no one had seen. The Japanese commanders tried to reform their lines. Admiral Ozawa transferred his flag to another carrier, the Zuikaku, one of the last survivors of the early war. But the balance of power was already broken. The air groups launched from the remaining carriers were intercepted and annihilated. American radar-guided fighters tore through them with mechanical precision. For every Japanese plane that reached the American fleet, 10 were lost along the way. The ocean was littered with burning aircraft, their wreckage drifting like paper ash across miles of blue. It was the end of Japanese naval aviation, and yet no one aboard those ships could admit it. As night fell, the surviving Japanese vessels turned west, fleeing toward Okinawa. The fires on the horizon faded. The stars emerged again, cold and infinite. The submarine Albacore, hundreds of feet below, began her ascent. When the periscope broke the surface, it saw nothing but darkness and silence. The sea was calm again. The men inside the submarine breathed the night air as if it were the first they had ever known. They did not know that beneath those same stars, the Empire's last dream of naval supremacy had drowned. For Admiral Ozawa, the hours after the sinking of the Taihō were consumed by silence and disbelief. He could not reconcile what had happened. He had believed in that ship, as one believes in faith itself. Its destruction was not merely a tactical loss, it was an existential wound. Reports from other carriers were grim. Pilots failed to return. Radio silence fell over the fleet. The American carrier groups, untouched and immense, moved through the night like steel islands. The battle that Japan had planned as its final decisive engagement had turned into a massacre. On the American side, the victory was complete but strangely quiet. There was no cheering aboard the carriers, no celebration. The pilots who landed back on their decks saw the wreckage of what they had done and felt only exhaustion. They had flown through walls of fire and steel, watched enemy planes burst into flame around them, and returned alive. The statistics were staggering. Over 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of fewer than 30 American planes. The Imperial Navy had lost its air arm in a single day. Yet few knew that far below, a submarine had struck the blow that had set this destruction in motion. For the men of the Albacore, the war continued in the same rhythm of tension and waiting. They recorded the explosion in their log, noted probable damage to an enemy carrier, and moved on. There were no witnesses to confirm what they had achieved, no cameras to record it. The sea swallowed every trace. Their victory existed only in the vibrations they had felt through the hull, in the brief tremor that had run along the steel and told them that somewhere above, something vast had been struck. That was enough. But in the cold logic of history, the significance of that moment cannot be overstated. The destruction of the Taihō was not merely the loss of a ship. It was the collapse of an illusion. Japan had built her as a fortress, believing that armor could protect against fate. Yet the very design that was meant to save her had ensured her doom. The sealed hangars, the enclosed ventilation, the armored deck, all features born from fear of bombs, had transformed her into a pressure chamber. The submarine's single torpedo had done little more than open the wound. The ship's own engineering had finished the job. In the days that followed, the Japanese fleet withdrew, shattered and broken. The Americans advanced, capturing Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. From those islands, long-range bombers would soon rise, carrying the war to Tokyo itself. The sinking of the Taihō was the last moment when Japan might have halted that advance. It failed not because of lack of courage, but because courage alone could no longer change the outcome. The industrial might of the United States, the endless production of ships, planes, and ammunition, had rendered individual valor meaningless. The Pacific had become an arena where endurance and machinery decided destiny. The Tai's wreck lay deep on the seabed, her steel hull twisted by pressure. Inside, the remnants of her crew rested among the silence. Over the months that followed, the sea claimed her completely. Coral grew over her frames, fish moved through the empty corridors where men had once run. Her name faded from the reports, her loss obscured by censorship and the shame of defeat. Only after the war would the full story emerge from survivors, from captured records, from the logs of submarines like the Albacore that had recorded their strikes in silence. For the submarine force, the victory was one among many. American submarines would go on to sink over 5 million tons of Japanese shipping before the war ended. Yet the destruction of the Taihō stood apart. It represented the turning of the tide, the point at which Japan's surface navy ceased to matter. After that day, the Imperial fleet never again sailed in strength. Its carriers were gone, its pilots dead, its fuel reserves exhausted. The empire that had once spanned half the Pacific was collapsing inward, retreating toward its own shores. The war beneath the waves remained as brutal as ever. The Albacore returned to Pearl Harbor resupplied, and set out again. Each patrol was more dangerous than the last. The Japanese had improved their anti-submarine tactics, deploying new sonar and minefields around their remaining harbors. But the American submarines continued to strike, relentless and unseen. The crew of the Albacore became ghosts of the sea, moving from one mission to the next without pause. They never learned the full impact of their attack on the Taihō. The news reached the fleet in fragments, passed quietly through channels, classified, and buried among the thousands of reports that defined the war's machinery. By the time the war ended, few remembered the submarine that had fired that single torpedo. The names of admirals, generals, and battles filled the headlines. The men who had fought beneath the waves slipped back into anonymity. But in the silence of the deep, their legacy remained. Every steel coffin that dove into the Pacific carried within it the same paradox: the human capacity for courage inside a machine built for destruction. The Pacific War was decided not only by strength, but by endurance. The American crews who hunted in the dark, and the Japanese sailors who died in their steel cities beneath the waves shared the same fate. Both were consumed by the ocean's indifference. The battle between the Taihō and the Albacore was not a contest of glory, but of inevitability. One represented an empire's last belief in invincibility, the other, a nation's mastery of persistence. As night closed over the Philippine Sea, the fires burned themselves out, the wrecks cooled, the survivors drifted, praying to be found. In the morning, only oil and wreckage remained. The waves rolled on, erasing the lines of battle, carrying the dead toward unseen shores. In that endless movement, the Pacific reclaimed what both sides had lost: the illusion that anything human could endure within its depths. The sea was eternal. The ships were not. The submarine would vanish in time, the carrier already gone. But the story of that single strike would echo through generations as proof of the strange balance between fate and design that governs Eve. War. The war moved on, but the sea kept its silence. Months passed after the battle in the Philippine Sea, and the wreck of the Taihō sank deeper into obscurity. The currents swept over her remains, scattering fragments of steel across the seafloor. The name that had once been spoken with reverence in Tokyo was now whispered in shame, avoided in public reports, buried beneath euphemisms. Official communiques called her loss an accident, a temporary misfortune, a technical malfunction. The truth that the pride of the Imperial Navy had been destroyed by a single submarine torpedo and a chain of human errors was too bitter to admit. Japan's people would not learn the full story until long after the war had ended, but in the quiet rooms of Naval Command, the implications were understood. The Taihō's destruction marked the final collapse of Japan's carrier power. No amount of courage or training could compensate for the loss of her experienced crews and her modern air fleet. Her death left the combined fleet without a heart, without the symbol that had held its confidence together. Admiral Ozawa, who had once believed in destiny, sailed home a broken man. The defeat in the Philippine Sea was total: 3 carriers lost, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, thousands of men gone. Japan's last great fleet action had ended not with victory, but with silence. On the American side, the results of that day became part of a growing pattern of inevitability. The United States now controlled the air, the sea, and the logistics of the Pacific. From newly captured bases on Saipan and Guam, the long-range bombers began their slow and terrible work. Japan's cities, once beyond the reach of war, would soon burn under the weight of industrial fire. The destruction of the Taihō was more than a tactical success, it was a symbol of transition, a moment when technology replaced tradition, when endurance outweighed pride. It was a turning point that passed almost unnoticed amid the greater storms of history. For the men of the USS Albacore, there was no celebration. They received brief commendation, another patrol order, and a return to sea. The submarine became one of many in the endless cycle of war, its victories recorded in terse lines of typewriter text. Enemy carrier probable sinking. That was all history would see, a few words written by men who could not imagine the scale of what they had done. The crew slept in narrow bunks beside the same torpedoes that might one day fail them, ate their meals beside the same machinery that filled their lungs with oil and smoke, and watched the sea pass above their periscope. For them, the war was not glory but routine and endless rhythm of danger and exhaustion. The Albacore completed her next patrol in the South China Sea, then returned once more to the northern waters off Japan. It was November 1944 when she vanished, somewhere near Hokkaido, believed lost to a minefield. No distress signal was ever received. The ocean took her quietly, as it had taken so many before. 58 men disappeared into the deep, their graves unmarked, their names carved only into the memory of the Navy that sent them. They never knew that the ship they had sunk months before had been the largest, most powerful carrier Japan ever built. They never knew that their torpedo had ended an empire's dream. The sea, indifferent to both victory and loss, absorbed them all. For the sailors of both nations, the war beneath the waves was fought in anonymity. There were no witnesses to their courage except the sea itself. They lived in the space between silence and annihilation, where every sound could mean the end, and every moment of calm felt borrowed. When the war finally ended in August 1945, few of the surviving submariners celebrated. They had given everything they had to a war that had devoured millions. The surface fleets would be remembered in parades and photographs, but the submarines remained invisible, their triumphs unspoken, their sacrifices hidden in classified reports. When Japan surrendered, the ruins of its empire stretched from Burma to the Kuril Islands. Cities lay in ashes, fleets rusted in harbors, and the sea lanes that had once fed the empire were empty. Among the wrecks scattered across the Pacific, the remains of the Taihō rested as the silent witness to that transformation. Divers who later reached her reported the eerie stillness of the sight. Her flight deck lay broken, her bow buried in sand, her stern twisted by pressure. The massive armored plates, once meant to resist bombs, were peeled back like petals by the force of internal explosions. Round her lay fragments of aircraft, helmets, and tools, reminders of the men who had fought to save her as she died. History often forgets the quiet moments that define its course. The great battles of the Pacific, the Coral Sea, Midway, Light Gulf are cited in books and classrooms. But the story of the Taihō and the Albacore exists on a different scale. It is the story of precision and irony, of courage obscured by machinery, of one shot that changed the balance of the ocean. It reveals something deeper about the nature of war, that even in an age of vast fleets and industrial power, destiny could turn on a single calculation, a single human decision made in the shadows. In every war there are moments when belief collapses. For Japan, that moment came not with surrender in Tokyo Bay, but months earlier, beneath the sunlit waters of the Philippine Sea. The destruction of the Taihō stripped away the last illusion of control. It revealed that no fortress, no armor, no faith in divine wind could protect against the inevitability of exhaustion and error. The sea had no sides, only depth. It consumed friend and foe alike. The men who built the Taihō had believed in permanence. The men who sank her understood impermanence too well. In the post-warriors, as peace settled uneasily over the Pacific, the story of the Taihō remained largely forgotten. Her name did not carry the infamy of the Yamato or the glory of the Shikoku. She was remembered only in the lists of the lost, one more casualty among thousands. Yet for those who study the war's history, her end stands as a parable. She represented the culmination of an idea, the belief that human ingenuity could master destruction through design. But war is never mastered. The very technologies that promise protection often deliver ruin. In the Tai's armored decks and sealed compartments lay the seeds of her doom. Just as in the Albacore's torpedo lay the silent precision of a new age. The men who built and sailed her did not lack courage. They lived and died according to the traditions of a navy that prized honor above all else. The officers who remained aboard as she sank did so with the calm acceptance of men raised in a culture of sacrifice. The same could be said for the submariners who spent their final hours somewhere off Hokkaido, trapped beneath tons of steel. Both sides were bound by the same devotion, the same obedience to forces greater than themselves. The difference was not in courage, but in circumstance. One side's courage was spent defending the past, the other's shaping the future. When historians speak of the turning points of the Pacific War, they mention numbers and dates: ships sunk, planes destroyed, territories taken. But beyond those numbers lies a truth that statistics cannot hold. The war was not merely an industrial contest. It was a human reckoning. Each decision, each mistake, each act of endurance contributed to an outcome that no one fully understood until it was over. The torpedo that struck the Taihō was guided by mathematics, but it was fired by men whose hands trembled with fatigue and fear. The explosion that consumed the carrier was born from design flaws and human errors, but also from pride and faith. Together, they formed the anatomy of defeat. In the decades that followed, the Pacific became peaceful again. Merchant ships crossed the same waters that had once run red with oil and fire. Nations rebuilt, traded, and forgot. The sea erased the scars of battle, yet beneath its calm surface, the relics remained. The Taihō lies there still, silent and rusting, her decks home to coral and fish. The Albacore too rests in darkness, her hull half buried in silt, her torpedo tubes still facing an invisible enemy. Between them lies the distance of belief, the belief that men could shape fate, that war could be controlled, that technology could grant immortality. Both ships proved the opposite. The story of their meeting is not one of triumph but of consequence. The submarine's precision, the carrier's destruction, the fleet's collapse, all were parts of a pattern that revealed the end of one world and the beginning of another. After the Taihō sank, the age of the great battleships and armored carriers was over. In its place came an era defined by speed, distance, and information. The lessons learned from that day in the Philippine Sea would shape the navies of the future: the importance of ventilation, the management of fuel, the fragility of complex systems under stress. In that sense, the Taihō did not die in vain. She became a teacher for generations who would never know her name. For those who study war, there is a haunting beauty in its symmetry. The Albacore and the Taihō were born from the same sea, built by hands that believed in mastery and permanence. Both returned to the depths that created them. Both carried men who never saw the sky again. The difference between them lies not in victory or defeat, but in understanding. One side learned that no amount of armor could protect against inevitability. The other learned that no victory lasts forever. As the decades pass, the sound of their story fades. The sea remains. The world above moves on, its cities rebuilt, its people distant from the echoes of that war. But sometimes, when the ocean is calm and the light fades to gray, it is possible to imagine the shapes that lie beneath the curve of a hull, the glint of corroded metal, the silence of a ship that once carried thousands of lives. The Pacific keeps their memory in the only language it knows: depth, pressure, stillness. And so the story ends where it began, beneath the surface. A submarine waits in silence. A torpedo drifts toward a target that believes itself invincible. A single explosion blooms in the dark. Above, the sea ripples once and closes again unbroken. The war moves forward. The world turns, and history records the event in numbers. But somewhere in that instant, between the strike and the silence, between pride and collapse, lies the truth of all wars: that valor and resilience are not measured by victory, but by the endurance of those who fought, those who waited, and those who vanished without a sound.